6 months ago, my HOA president declared war over a fence. She stood in my driveway screaming that my privacy was against community values. Neighbors gathered, whispering, filming everything on their phones. I just smiled and said, "Noted." Behind my calm face, I was already redrawing blueprints. Deborah didn't know what she just triggered. 3 weeks later, her own board turned against her. What I built next made the whole street stop breathing. My name is Mara Doyle, structural engineer, wife, and mother of 2. And for 11 years Willowcrest Estates had been our quiet corner of the world. The kind of place where sprinklers hissed on schedule and nobody's grass ever seemed to grow too fast. We'd bought our lot precisely because it backed onto protected woodland. The one place in the neighborhood where a family could actually breathe without someone judging the height of your hedges or the color of your mailbox. Life there was ordinary in the best way. Barbecues that ran late into warm evenings. Soccer practice on Saturday mornings. Waving to neighbors on evening walks with the dog straining at his leash. I never imagined that a 6-foot cedar fence, built to code, permitted through the county, and standing quietly for years, would become the opening move in the strangest, most consuming fight of my adult life. Deborah Wexler had run the Willowcrest HOA for 9 years, and everyone had a story about her, told in the particular hushed tone reserved for people you're a little afraid of. She measured lawns with a tape measure. She once fined a widow for unauthorized wind chimes that had hung, undisturbed, for a decade. People joked about her at cookouts, but nobody actually crossed her, because Deborah made absolutely certain that crossing her cost you something real. When we moved in, an older neighbor pulled me aside near the moving truck and said, quietly, almost like a warning passed between soldiers, "Whatever she asks, just say yes. It's easier that way. Trust me." I laughed it off then, assuming she was exaggerating for effect. I understood the full weight of that sentence only much later. Deborah's house sat higher up the hill above ours. Floor-to-ceiling windows facing directly down into our backyard and the protected woods beyond it. A view she bragged about at every single block party, calling it, without a trace of irony, the best seat in all of Willowcrest. Hands down. Our cedar fence had stood for 6 full years without a single complaint. Built the same summer we moved in. Inspected and formally approved by the county building office. It had never once been an issue. Not a whisper. Not a note. Not until this particular spring, when everything about our quiet street suddenly, inexplicably changed. That April, Deborah was up for re-election as HOA president, running completely unopposed as always, mostly because nobody else in Willowcrest wanted the exhausting headache of dealing with her constant emails when they eventually, inevitably lost the position back to her the following year anyway. A rumor started circulating around that time that a developer had quietly approached Deborah about a view corridor bonus for homes bordering the
protected woodland, a private incentive program that could meaningfully raise resale values specifically along her side of the street, and nobody else's.
I didn't think much of it at the time. Honestly. Developer gossip floated constantly through Willowcrest's group chats, usually amounting to absolutely nothing concrete. I was busy that month with a bridge inspection contract downtown and my daughter's dance recital costume, which somehow needed 3 separate alterations. Then, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, an HOA notice appeared folded neatly in our mailbox. A friendly reminder that all fences exceeding 4 feet in height now required special board review. effective immediately, and applied retroactively to structures already standing for years. The notice carried exactly one signature, Deborah Wexler, HOA President, printed in bold beneath a small clip art American flag. No board vote was listed anywhere on the page. No community meeting was cited as its origin. Just a decree, printed neatly on HOA letterhead, taped carefully inside a plastic sleeve for protection from the rain. I called the HOA office that same afternoon, half expecting an explanation I could quickly resolve. The woman on the phone sounded tired and said plainly, "Deborah wrote that herself. Actually, the board hasn't formally voted on fence height in years." That was twist number one. This wasn't policy at all. It was personal, and it was aimed squarely at us. I stood at my kitchen window afterward, staring at our fence. 6 honest feet of solid cedar separating my children's swing set from Deborah's binoculars' clear view of our yard. And I understood, all at once, exactly why she'd suddenly discovered such passionate feelings about community standards. My husband Tom, ever the peacemaker in every disagreement we'd ever had, said we should simply talk to her directly, clear the air over coffee, and avoid unnecessary drama entirely. I agreed at the time, mostly because I still, somewhat foolishly, believed Deborah operated on anything resembling reason or fairness. I scheduled a coffee meeting with Deborah for that coming Friday morning. She confirmed cheerfully within minutes, signing her text with 3 exclamation points, the exact kind of practiced warmth that I would soon learn the hard way, only ever seemed to precede a carefully planned ambush. I spent that entire week pulling together our original permits, our county fence approval paperwork, and dated photos from the initial construction habits. Built over 12 years as a working engineer, where you never, ever walk into a difficult meeting without your documentation already organized and ready. Friday came. The coffee shop 20 minutes late. Sunglasses still on indoors. Trailed by 2 silent board members who said absolutely nothing the entire meeting and mostly just stared down into their coffee cups, avoiding my eyes completely. She opened with, "I just think 6 feet is an awful lot of fence for a family your size. Don't you think?" Which told me nothing whatsoever about actual fencing regulations and everything about what she actually meant underneath the pleasant, sing-song delivery of the comment. I slid my permit documents carefully across the table toward her. She barely glanced down at them. "Permits change over time," she said flatly. "Community standards matter more." In the end, it wasn't really a conversation at all. It was a script, clearly rehearsed, that she'd already written long before we sat down. When I asked, directly, why this particular rule had appeared overnight with no board vote behind it anywhere, she smiled thinly and said, "I have discretion in urgent matters." Mara, I asked what exactly was urgent about a fence that had stood peacefully for 6 entire years. She simply didn't answer that question. As we finally left the coffee shop, one of the silent board members lingered a half-step behind Deborah and mouthed, almost apologetically, "I'm sorry," before hurrying to catch up with her. That was twist number 2. Her own hand-picked board apparently didn't fully agree with what she was doing to us. That night, I genuinely couldn't sleep. Not from fear exactly, but from the particular, slow-burning fury of watching someone use a title, a laminated little badge of borrowed authority, to bully an ordinary family over nothing more than her own personal view from a hilltop window. I decided then, lying awake beside Tom, that I wouldn't fight Deborah with anger, however satisfying that might have felt in the moment. I'd fight her the exact way I'd been trained to fight every difficult problem in my career, with documentation, patience, and a plan she would never, ever see coming until it was already built. The following Monday, a certified letter arrived at our door, a formal violation notice, giving us exactly 30 days to lower our fence to 4 feet or face daily fines of $150, escalating sharply after the first 60 days had passed without compliance. I called the county planning office directly to confirm our permit was still legally valid. It was, without question. The clerk, sounding almost amused by the question, said, "HOAs can suggest their own standards. Sure, but they absolutely cannot override a county-approved permit. That's just basic property law." Ma'am, armed with that clear confirmation, I emailed Deborah and the entire board together, attaching both our original permit and the county's written confirmation, politely explaining that the threatened fine was legally unenforceable as written. I honestly expected an apology, or at the very least an uncomfortable silence. Instead, Deborah replied to absolutely everyone, CCNG the whole board on her response, insisting that HOA bylaws supersede county minimums in matters of aesthetic harmony, a phrase that, as it turned out, existed nowhere at all in the association's actual governing documents. My neighbor, Priya Chan, texted me late that night, her message arriving in nervous little bursts. She did this to us 2 years ago over a garden shed. We just paid the fine and moved on. Nobody wants to actually fight her, Mara. She makes your whole life hell if you try. That was twist number 3. I wasn't the first target after all. Deborah apparently had a long, quiet pattern, rarely challenged by anyone, of manufacturing sudden violations against whoever's yard happened to interfere with something specific that she personally wanted for herself. I asked Priya what exactly Deborah had wanted with the shed situation back then. Priya paused for a long moment before answering honestly. "A better sight line down to the creek," she said. Called it improving neighborhood value with a straight face. Sound at all familiar to you? I began quietly reading through 9 full years of archived HOA meeting minutes, available by written request, curious just how many other urgent rules had conveniently appeared exactly when they happened to benefit the view from Deborah's hilltop house specifically. I found 4 separate examples. A fence, a garden shed, a tidy row of arborvitae trees, and a portable basketball hoop, each one cited under a different bylaw violation, each removed within a single season, each one quietly restoring an unobstructed sightline straight to Deborah's windows. Meanwhile, the violation letters kept arriving at our house, weekly now, almost gleeful in tone, repeatedly threatening formal liens on our property if the fence wasn't altered soon. Tom, exhausted by the constant mail, quietly suggested we just comply and move on with our lives. I refused, and firmly, not purely out of stubbornness, but because I now understood clearly that we weren't dealing with some well-meaning, if overzealous, rule follower. We were dealing with someone who treated the entire HOA like her own personal home renovation budget, funded by everyone else's dues. At the next open board meeting, I stood up during the public comment period and calmly read the county's written confirmation aloud, word for word, along with the clear pattern I'd painstakingly found buried across 9 years of official meeting minutes. The room went completely, deadly silent. Deborah's face didn't move a muscle, but her knuckles visibly went white around the wooden gavel in her hand. One older board member, a quiet man named Frank, sat very still and quietly wrote something down in his notepad without looking up. Deborah recovered quickly, forcing a smile back onto her face for the watching room. "That's an interesting theory," she said smoothly. "But the board stands firmly by our community aesthetic standards." She adjourned the meeting a full 11 minutes early, before anyone else could ask a single follow-up question. Afterward, out in the parking lot, Frank approached me quietly, glancing once over his shoulder. "You're not wrong about any of it," he said under his breath. "But be careful, Mara. She's had people effectively driven off this board for saying far less than what you just said tonight." I asked him directly whether Deborah had some deeper personal or financial motive behind all of this. He hesitated for a long, uncomfortable moment, then said only, "Ask about the HOA reserve fund sometime. Ask who actually audits it these days." Then he simply walked away into the dark. That was twist number 4. Small but genuinely sharp, this fight clearly wasn't only about a view from a window anymore. There was money tangled up somewhere in this story too. And Frank obviously knew more than he was willing to say plainly, out loud, in a parking lot. I filed a formal written records request for the HOA's complete financial statements the very next morning, citing our state's HOA transparency statute directly, which legally entitles any homeowner to review association finances upon a proper written request. The HOA office took 2 entire weeks to respond, well past the statutory legal deadline, finally sending over a heavily redacted PDF document with whole sections blacked out under the vague, convenient excuse of vendor confidentiality concerns. Redacted or not, one single line still stood out sharply, a $40,000 landscaping and view enhancement line item, approved solely and directly by Deborah herself, with no vendor name listed, no invoice attached, and absolutely no board vote recorded anywhere in the file. I saved the document carefully, printed a hard copy for good measure, and locked the original safely away in our fireproof safe at home. Whatever Deborah genuinely believed this fight was still about, I now understood it was something far bigger than a fence, and my quiet plan was about to become bigger too. The fines kept arriving weekly after that, stacking neatly into a folder I labeled Exhibit A without a hint of irony intended. Each single letter becoming a data point I strongly suspected would matter far more later than Deborah currently realized. Deborah escalated things publicly too. Right around then, at the annual community picnic, she gave a pointed little speech about neighbors who think the rules simply don't apply to them, never once naming me directly, but staring squarely at our picnic table the entire time she spoke. My son Eli, 8 years old at the time, asked me quietly that evening why the fence lady didn't seem to like our family very much anymore. I told him some grown-ups make rules just to get what they personally want, not because the rules are actually fair to everyone. He nodded slowly, like he understood far more than I'd expected him to. Someone, I never did confirm exactly who, began leaving small, passive-aggressive notes tucked into our mailbox. Good neighbors respect community harmony, printed in a careful, deliberate script. I photographed each note and quietly added it to Exhibit A without ever saying a single word to anyone about it. Priyachan, emboldened a little by watching that meeting unfold, quietly told me that 2 other families on our street had also been hit with sudden, urgent violations that same spring, each one involving a structure standing near a direct sightline toward Deborah's house. I began carefully mapping it all out on a spreadsheet: address, violation type, exact date, and a rough compass angle pointing toward Deborah's windows. The pattern, once laid out visually on the page in front of me, was honestly almost too clean and precise to be pure coincidence. Tom, initially hesitant about the whole thing, started genuinely helping me compile it after his own tense encounter with Deborah at the mailbox one afternoon, where she'd told him bluntly, with a smile, "Tell your wife this really doesn't end well for people who decide to fight me directly." That comment, delivered with such an easy, practiced smile, was the exact moment Tom stopped wanting to simply comply and quietly started wanting, quite fiercely, to actually win this thing outright. "She just openly threatened us," he said that night, still visibly rattled. I hired a licensed land surveyor shortly after, ostensibly just to confirm our property lines for the ongoing fence dispute, but really to quietly settle a growing hunch I'd had ever since reading that redacted financial document weeks earlier at our kitchen table. The survey came back with something genuinely unexpected. A narrow 15-foot strip running along our northern property line, sitting between our yard and Deborah's, was legally unclaimed by anyone at all, mistakenly omitted from both deeds during some decades-old subdivision paperwork error nobody had ever caught. That was twist number 5. And it was a significant one. The narrow buffer of land Deborah's beloved $1 million view actually passed directly through wasn't fully hers, or ours, or technically anyone's at all. It was still, remarkably, available to legally claim through the county's own process. I said nothing about it to anyone outside our own household. I simply began, quietly and entirely legally, the paperwork necessary to claim adverse possession and file for a formal boundary correction, a process our lawyer warned could easily take several patient months to fully resolve. Meanwhile, Deborah filed a formal lien threat against our house through the HOA's retained attorney, citing unresolved architectural violations in stiff legal language, despite having zero actual board authorization behind it and a county permit that directly, explicitly contradicted her entire claim. My own attorney, a calm and unflappable woman named Renata who specialized specifically in HOA disputes, read the lien threat over once and laughed sharply. Just once. "This absolutely will not survive 5 minutes in front of any judge," she said. "But it will cost you real time. That's the actual weapon she's using here, Mara." We responded formally, in writing, demanding Deborah produce the specific board vote that had supposedly authorized the lien threat. No response came for a full 11 days. When it finally arrived, it was exactly 1 line long. "The board stands united behind this decision." Frank, the older board member, quietly told me sometime later that no such vote had ever actually taken place at all. Deborah had simply told the rest of the board it had passed, and nobody on that board had apparently ever had the nerve to go back and actually check the official minutes. I requested a certified copy of that specific meeting's official minutes soon after. The HOA office couldn't locate them anywhere. That was twist number 6. Inconvenient records seemed to conveniently vanish entirely whenever they might directly contradict Deborah's carefully maintained version of events. I started recording every single interaction with her after that discovery. Phone tucked quietly in my pocket. Voice memo running discreetly. Careful habit I'd picked up over years of documenting messy contractor disputes on job sites, where casual verbal promises meant absolutely nothing without solid proof behind them. Deborah, entirely unaware of the recording, cornered me one quiet afternoon by our row of mailboxes and said plainly, almost conspiratorially, If you just drop this whole fence nonsense, I'll make your HOA fees quietly disappear for a full year. Nobody else ever has to know about it. I said nothing at all, and simply let the recorder keep running. That single recording became, without question, the most valuable piece of evidence in the entire Exhibit A folder. Direct, completely unambiguous proof of an HOA president openly offering to waive legitimate fees in exchange for silence on what was clearly a fraudulent violation dispute from the very beginning. I sent a copy of it straight to Renata that same evening. She listened to the transcript twice through, then said quietly, her tone suddenly much more serious, "Mara, this genuinely isn't just an HOA dispute anymore. Depending on our state's exact statute, this could actually qualify as outright bribery." I didn't tell Tom right away just how serious things had become. Not yet, at least. I wanted one more solid piece of evidence before making my next move, proof directly connecting Deborah, personally and unmistakably, to that suspicious $40,000 landscaping line item still sitting in the HOA's books. I filed yet another formal records request, this time specifically demanding vendor invoices tied directly to that landscaping fund, citing the exact statute Renata had flagged for me, and giving the HOA office a firm 14 days to respond under threat of an official state complaint. Deborah's response came fast this time, faster than any before. A phone call from the HOA's own retained attorney, not Deborah herself, sternly warning me that continued harassment of the board could potentially result in the association pursuing formal legal action against our entire family directly. I told him calmly, without raising my voice even slightly, that requesting legally mandated financial records wasn't harassment of anyone. It was a plain homeowner's legal right, and that I looked forward, genuinely, to discussing that exact point with a judge if the association truly wished to pursue it further. He hung up the phone without so much as a goodbye. 2 full days later, an invoice finally, grudgingly arrived, made out to DW Landscape Consulting LLC, a small company registered, I discovered within a single hour of searching, directly to Deborah's own younger sister. That was twist number 7. And a big one. The entire $40,000 view enhancement fund hadn't actually gone to any real outside vendor at all. It had gone, quietly and technically legally on paper, straight into Deborah's own extended family's personal pocket the whole time. I sat alone at our kitchen table that night with the invoice, the bribery recording, the survey results, and 9 full years of meeting minutes spread out carefully in front of me like puzzle pieces finally, slowly forming a complete picture worth showing to somebody with real authority. Renata reviewed absolutely everything I'd gathered and said plainly what I'd honestly been quietly thinking for weeks already. You genuinely don't need to
keep fighting her fence by fence anymore. Mara, you have more than enough here to end her entire presidency outright, if you're willing to be patient about it.
Patience, though, wasn't at all the plan Deborah herself was expecting from me by that point. She fully expected me to eventually lower our fence, offer some quiet apology, and disappear right back into the same obedient compliance everyone before us apparently eventually had. Instead, I called a licensed contractor. Not for any simple fence repair, though. For something else entirely, something I'd been quietly, carefully sketching out on old blueprint paper every single night after the kids had finally gone to bed for the evening. For nearly 2 full weeks after that, everything went strangely, unnervingly quiet. No new violation letters arrived. No notes appeared on our mailbox. No pointed speeches at any picnics. Deborah, for once in this whole ordeal, seemed to be carefully waiting rather than actively attacking us directly. I used that unexpected calm to finish up paperwork with the county, the boundary correction on that 15-foot strip, still slowly moving through official channels, along with fresh permits for an entirely new structure I hadn't yet told a single soul about outside our own home. Tom and I took the kids camping that particular weekend, our first genuine trip away in months where nobody mentioned Deborah's name even once the entire time. Eli caught his very first fish off the dock. For 2 whole days, all of Willowcrest felt very, very far away from us. Priya invited our whole family over for dinner that week, and for the very first time in ages, our entire conversation wasn't consumed by the HOA at all. We talked instead about her daughter's soccer team, my upcoming bridge inspection trip out of state, and other pleasantly ordinary things. I still checked our mailbox every single day out of sheer habit, half expecting another certified letter to appear at any moment. None ever came. Her kind of prolonged silence usually only meant one thing in her experience. The other side was quietly regrouping, not actually surrendering at all. She turned out to be entirely right about that. A neighbor mentioned offhand at the farmer's market that Deborah had reportedly been seen meeting privately with the HOA's attorney twice that same week. Unusual outside of any scheduled board business, according to the association's own office assistant. I didn't chase down that particular rumor any further. I had learned by then, the hard way, that quiet patience gathered far better evidence than panic ever could. And I still genuinely needed the county paperwork fully finalized before making any real next move of my own. My permit for the entirely new structure, technically classified on paper as a privacy partition, per specific county code, since it exceeded the standard residential fence height, cleared final review on an otherwise quiet Wednesday afternoon with almost no fanfare whatsoever attached to it. I told Tom the news that same night, spreading the fully approved plans carefully across our kitchen table under the overhead light. He stared down at the drawing for a long, silent moment, then suddenly started laughing so hard he genuinely had to sit down in his chair. 70 feet. Mara? Made entirely of glass? You want to build the woman a giant mirror. I told him, quite seriously, that it wasn't a mirror at all. It was a carefully engineered message, permitted, built entirely to code, and completely, deliciously, unquestionably legal from top to bottom. He asked the obvious, practical question next: could we actually even afford something this ambitious? I told him all about the newly claimed 15-foot strip, now legally ours pending only final county sign-off, and the growing plans slowly forming around exactly what we intended to eventually do with it. We agreed, together, to say absolutely nothing to Deborah, or to anyone else in Willowcrest, until construction had actually, physically begun. Some surprises, I told him with a small smile, only really work if nobody sees them coming until it's already far too late to stop. The following Monday morning, final county approval for the boundary correction officially landed in our shared inbox. The 15-foot strip was now permanently, legally ours. Construction crews were scheduled to arrive that coming Thursday, promptly at 7 o'clock in the morning. Sharp. Thursday morning, 3 large trucks rolled slowly onto our quiet street well before sunrise, loaded down with heavy steel framing and entire pallets of tempered glass panels wrapped tightly in protective plastic film, drawing sleepy, curious neighbors straight to their front windows almost immediately. Deborah appeared out on her porch in a bathrobe by about 7:15, coffee mug frozen halfway to her open mouth, staring down the hill in obvious disbelief at the crew steadily unloading heavy equipment directly along our shared northern property line. By 8 o'clock, she was standing squarely in our driveway, no robe now, fully dressed and visibly furious, demanding loudly to know exactly what was happening and whether we'd even bothered to get any proper board approval for whatever this obviously was. I calmly handed her the official county permit, laminated the exact way she herself always liked to laminate her own little decrees, and said pleasantly, "Board approval genuinely isn't required here. This is entirely on land the county has already confirmed legally belongs to us." She read it through twice, her expression shifting visibly from anger to confusion to something noticeably colder as she reached the specific line describing the structure itself. 70 feet tall, laminated safety glass, formally rated to residential security standards throughout. "You absolutely cannot build that," she said sharply. "It's completely absurd. View for everyone." I told her, quite calmly, that was in fact precisely the intended function of the entire structure. Permits and all, exactly as designed. That same afternoon, the foundation trenches went in steadily along the boundary line, dug precisely on the strip the county had officially confirmed was ours, well outside any HOA jurisdiction Deborah could ever legitimately, honestly claim over the project. Neighbors gathered along the sidewalk in small, curious clusters, phones out and recording, filming the construction with the particular fascination reserved specifically for the exact moment a quiet suburban dispute finally turns visibly, undeniably real in front of everyone. Priya texted me a single excited line that morning. "Is this actually really happening right now?" I sent back a photo of the crew steadily pouring fresh concrete and simply wrote, "It's happening." She replied instantly with 4 exclamation points and a small laughing emoji. Deborah called an emergency board meeting for that same evening, giving almost no formal notice period at all, clearly hoping to somehow pass something official before the wall itself managed to climb any higher. I attended calmly, Renata seated right beside me, folder in hand. She opened the emergency meeting by demanding an immediate injunction against unauthorized construction disrupting community aesthetic harmony, the exact same tired phrase from months earlier, now noticeably worn thin from being overused so many times before. Renata stood and calmly explained, point by point, that the structure sat entirely on privately owned land outside any HOA-governed lot boundaries, was fully permitted by the county government itself, and that any injunction attempt at this point would clearly constitute serious legal overreach on the board's part. Frank, the quiet board member, finally spoke up publicly for what seemed like the first time in months. "Deborah, maybe we should actually sit down and read the bylaws properly before voting on things like this," he said evenly. The entire room went noticeably still. Deborah snapped sharply at him to simply sit back down, an instinctive reflex that, for the very first time anyone present could recall, visibly startled the rest of the board rather than quietly silencing them the way it always reliably had before. The vote on her requested injunction ultimately failed, 4 votes to 2. Marking the very first board vote openly against Deborah in 9 consecutive years, according to Frank, who told me afterward he'd honestly been waiting a very long time to finally cast it. Deborah stormed straight out of the meeting without even properly adjourning it, leaving the vice president to awkwardly close things out formally, quietly apologizing to the stunned room for a scene nobody there had genuinely ever witnessed before in Willowcrest's history. Construction steadily continued through the following week. The tall glass panels rising section by section, catching the warm afternoon sun in long, dazzling sheets clearly visible from 3 full streets over, according to neighbors who kept casually stopping by just to look. I hadn't chosen the exact location or precise height of the wall carelessly. Not even slightly. The structural plans, drawn up with an engineer's careful precision, deliberately placed the wall to completely block Deborah's window sightline while staying entirely, legally within our newly claimed strip. A local news blog, the kind that typically only covers small zoning disputes and school board drama, picked up the growing story after a neighbor posted construction photos online with the playful caption, "HOA war officially escalates into architecture." The article, quoting the county planning office directly and at length, confirmed the entire structure was fully permitted and completely legal, framing it as one homeowner's creative response to alleged HOA overreach. Deborah herself wasn't quoted anywhere in the piece. She had flatly declined to comment. Deborah's next move surprised even Renata a little. A formal cease and desist letter from a private attorney, entirely unaffiliated with the HOA itself, claiming the new glass wall somehow violated Deborah's own personal right to light and air as a homeowner. Renata researched the specific claim carefully and quickly found it had absolutely no legal standing whatsoever in our state, outside of narrow historic easement agreements that plainly didn't apply here at all, and told me confidently to expect the letter to go absolutely nowhere in the end. It did indeed go nowhere in the end, but it still cost us another 2 full weeks of frustrating delay while our lawyer formally responded in writing. Precisely the exact kind of friction Deborah seemed to genuinely specialize in creating for anyone brave enough to challenge her directly. During that particular delay, I learned from Priya that 2 more families in the neighborhood had quietly reached out to her privately, describing their own old disputes with Deborah, each one involving suspiciously convenient view-related violations stretching back several years. I began carefully compiling their stories too, methodical and patient about it, slowly building what Renata started calling a pattern case, not just proof of one single bad decision, but clear, documented proof of a consistent, years-long abuse of official position and public trust. Meanwhile, the wall itself kept steadily climbing higher. By the 3rd week of construction, it had reached 40 full feet, the steel framework gleaming brightly in the sun, glass panels installed section by careful section, engineered with a subtle reflective coating I honestly hadn't mentioned to anyone else just yet. Deborah, watching helplessly from her own hillside window, apparently didn't fully notice the coating's true purpose until the late afternoon sun hit it directly one day, throwing a wide, blinding sheet of reflected light straight into the middle of her own living room. A neighbor later told me that Deborah had actually called the county that very same day, demanding to know if reflective glass coatings were even legal in a residential zone, only to be told, once again, that our permits already fully, explicitly accounted for exactly that feature. That reflective panel honestly wasn't pure spite on my part alone. Structurally, it was simply standard high-performance glass. And legally, it was mandatory under county energy code for any structure of that particular height. Deborah's genuine discomfort was, at most, purely unplanned little bonus on top. Tension across the neighborhood shifted visibly after all that. People who once carefully avoided eye contact with me at the mailbox now openly stopped to ask quiet, curious questions, wondering aloud whether the growing rumors about Deborah's personal finances might actually, finally be true. I stayed deliberately careful, giving out no real details to anyone, only saying calmly that everything would come out in time. A simple phrase that, I noticed, seemed to visibly unsettle Deborah far more than any direct argument I could have possibly made to her face. She began skipping our shared mailbox area entirely after that, having her personal mail collected discreetly by an assistant instead, and quietly stopped attending the weekly farmers market where she'd always confidently held court, chatting up neighbors with her usual practiced, easy charm. Frank told me privately, over coffee one morning, that 2 other board members had started quietly asking him about the redacted financial statements themselves, word having spread slowly through the exact same neighborhood channels that once only ever carried idle gossip about hedges and paint colors. By week 5 of construction, the wall had reached a full 60 feet, and I finally finalized the second half of my overall plan, something Renata had actually first suggested half-jokingly during one of our earlier meetings, until I quietly decided it genuinely wasn't a joke at all. I filed the paperwork to formally register a small business, Ridgeline View Partners, offering scheduled, paid access to a private elevated observation platform I'd carefully built into the very top section of the wall, facing directly out over the protected woodland behind our home. The county permit allowed for limited commercial use on residential property under our local home business ordinance. Provided access remained strictly appointment only, parking impact stayed genuinely minimal, and the structure itself fully met all applicable safety code, all conditions ours comfortably satisfied. I quietly reached out to a local photography club and 2 separate birdwatching groups in the area, offering scheduled, modestly priced access to the new platform for its genuinely unmatched view of the woodland canopy and the nesting hawks visible below it. The irony wasn't lost on me even once. Honestly, Deborah had spent months relentlessly fighting to preserve one unobstructed view for herself. I had instead built a fully legal little business, charging complete strangers a modest fee to enjoy the exact same view she herself could no longer even see. The very first booking came within days of opening. A delighted wildlife photographer thrilled by the platform's unusual angle. I watched quietly from my own kitchen window as Deborah's porch light flicked on and off several times that particular evening, clearly visibly agitated about something. Word of the little business spread fast through all of Willowcrest. Half-genuine amusement, half-open disbelief, and someone, I still honestly don't know exactly who, printed up a flyer titled Rent-A-View and taped it directly to the community bulletin board for everyone to see. Deborah formally demanded the HOA shut the business down immediately, citing unauthorized commercial activity in a residential zone, conveniently ignoring that our county's own home business ordinance explicitly permitted exactly this kind of limited, appointment-based operation from the start. The HOA's own retained attorney, after actually reviewing her formal request, quietly advised the rest of the board there was simply no legal basis to act on it at all. According to Frank, who by then had started sharing far more with me than I'd ever really expected him to, that flat refusal from her own hired attorney seemed to genuinely break something in Deborah's usual careful composure. At the very next board meeting, she visibly raised her voice for what felt like the first time anyone present could actually remember, and over a fairly minor routine agenda item. No less. 2 board members quietly exchanged a knowing look I instantly recognized from years of watching stressed contractors slowly realize, mid-project, that their trusted foreman had been quietly lying to them the entire time about permits, inspections, and everything in between. After that particular meeting, an anonymous email arrived in my personal inbox late that night, entirely unsigned, containing scanned bank statements clearly showing repeated transfers from the HOA's reserve account to DW Landscape Consulting, stretching back nearly 4 full years in total. I forwarded everything straight to Renata immediately, without even pausing to fully process it myself first. She called me back within the hour, her voice noticeably sharper than usual. Mara, this genuinely isn't just thousands of dollars anymore. Across 4 full years, this is starting to look like it's well past 6 figures total. That was twist number 8. And it was a big one. Deborah hadn't simply skimmed a single fund once. Quietly, out of ordinary greed born from one particularly bad year, she had methodically built a slow, deliberate, years-long financial pipeline straight out of her own community's collective pockets. I sat with that staggering number for a long, quiet time before finally telling Tom about it that night. 6 figures wasn't some honest mistake or a defensible gray area at all. It was, quite plainly, outright theft, carefully dressed up for 9 straight years behind ordinary-looking landscaping invoices. Renata strongly advised formally reporting everything to the state's HOA Oversight Division and, separately, to the local police department as well, given that the sheer scale involved likely crossed well past a simple civil matter into outright criminal fraud under our specific state statutes. Before we could actually file anything formally, though, Deborah made a move that suddenly, dramatically changed the entire shape of the whole fight. One that had absolutely nothing at all to do with fences, or funds, or finances of any kind. Late one night, our home security camera caught someone crouched at the very base of the glass wall's foundation, moving slowly along the property line with a small flashlight, working quietly near the structure's main anchor points in the darkness. I woke Tom immediately, my heart already pounding hard in my chest. We watched the grainy footage together in silence as the shadowy figure worked at something near the base for nearly 10 full minutes before hurrying off quickly toward the hillside, toward Deborah's own house. I called Renata first thing the very next morning, then immediately called the county building inspector as well, requesting an emergency structural review before anyone else went anywhere near that particular section of the wall, given exactly what the footage seemed to clearly show. The inspector arrived within just a few hours and found 2 heavy anchor bolts partially, deliberately loosened by hand tools, clearly not the result of weather or simple settling, genuine sabotage aimed directly at a 70-foot structure standing dangerously close to a family home with young children. That was twist number 9. And honestly the ugliest one of the entire story so far. Deborah hadn't just crossed lines around bylaws and stolen money anymore. She had now escalated into something that could have genuinely, seriously hurt someone in my own family. I filed a formal police report immediately that same day, attaching the full security footage, clearly time-stamped and detailed enough to show the exact build, the figure's height, and their direct approach along the path connecting straight to Deborah's own backyard gate. The responding police officer reviewed the footage carefully, twice through, asked several pointed follow-up questions, and told us plainly that this now clearly qualified as criminal mischief and potentially reckless endangerment as well, given the structure's considerable height and close residential proximity. Deborah, when formally questioned by police the following day, according to what Frank later heard secondhand through the grapevine, denied absolutely everything, insisting she'd simply been home asleep, and offering no real explanation whatsoever for why her own backyard gate camera clearly showed otherwise. That particular gate camera, turned out, belonged to a smart doorbell company Deborah herself had once formally mandated the entire HOA install for community safety years earlier. a policy that, quite ironically now, ended up working entirely, decisively against her own interests. Police soon obtained a formal warrant for that specific footage. It clearly showed a figure leaving through Deborah's own back gate at 11:47 p.m. and returning again at 12:14 a.m., matching almost exactly the same window captured on our own home camera's timestamp that night. I honestly didn't feel any real celebration when I first heard the news. Mostly, I just felt a cold, settled kind of clarity, the same familiar feeling I used to get on job sites when a hidden structural flaw finally revealed exactly how serious it had truly been all along. Deborah's carefully maintained public composure, so meticulously built up over 9 long years, began visibly cracking apart after that. She skipped the next 2 board meetings entirely, citing sudden illness, while rumors of the ongoing sabotage investigation spread quickly through every corner of Willowcrest. Priya told me that people had genuinely started avoiding Deborah at the grocery store, at school pickup lines, small quiet withdrawals that honestly spoke far louder than any direct confrontation ever could, the particular quiet exile reserved specifically for someone the whole community now knew had been caught. Meanwhile, I finalized my complete formal complaint to the state's HOA Oversight Division, carefully attaching the bank statements, the shell company invoice, 9 full years of meeting minutes, and the recorded bribery attempt from several months earlier, all organized neatly together. Renata warned me the entire review process could still take several more months to fully play out, but that the sheer volume and clarity of the evidence made this one of the genuinely strongest cases she had personally handled in her long HOA-focused legal practice. Deborah, perhaps finally sensing the walls closing in on her from multiple directions at once, tried one final desperate maneuver, calling a special community-wide vote to formally remove me and Tom from the HOA entirely, under an obscure, rarely used bylaw buried deep in the governing documents. That particular bylaw, tucked away deep within the association's original founding documents, technically allowed removal of members for conduct detrimental to community harmony, a clause so deliberately vague it had apparently never once been formally invoked anywhere in Willowcrest's entire 9-year history before now. She needed a clear majority of homeowners present at the meeting to vote in her favor, and scheduled the whole thing with unusually short public notice, clearly hoping to push it through quickly before word of the ongoing sabotage investigation could fully spread through the neighborhood. The night of the vote, the community center parking lot filled up faster than anyone present could actually remember happening before. Cars lining both sides of the street for blocks. Neighbors arriving unusually early just to secure decent seats near the very front of the room. Deborah stood confidently at the podium, composed once again, opening with a familiar, practiced speech about protecting the core values that make Willowcrest truly special, the exact same warm, rehearsed tone I'd first heard across that coffee shop table so many months earlier. When she finally called for open public comment, I stood up calmly, thanked the room politely for their time, and simply asked one direct question. Would anyone here like to know what actually happened to $40,000 of our own reserve fund? The room went completely, utterly silent. The specific kind of heavy silence that seems to have real physical weight to it. And I watched Deborah's hand visibly tighten hard around the edge of the wooden podium as every single head in the room slowly turned toward her. I laid everything out plainly and calmly for the room. The invoices, the sisters' shell company, the years-long pattern found across 9 years of records, the bribery recording, and finally, carefully, the ongoing sabotage investigation now fully underway with the local county police department. Frank stood up beside me then, entirely unprompted, and publicly confirmed what he'd only ever told me quietly in private before. The board vote supposedly authorizing those reserve fund transfers had genuinely never actually happened at all. Deborah had simply, repeatedly claimed that it had. Someone shouted from the back of the room, "Is this all actually true?" Deborah opened her mouth to respond, then quietly closed it again, her carefully practiced composure finally, visibly, completely failing her in front of the entire assembled community for the very first time. The proposed vote to remove me and Tom never even reached the floor for consideration in the end. Instead, another homeowner rose up and proposed an emergency motion of her own. Immediate suspension of Deborah Wexler pending a fully independent HOA financial audit. That motion passed by an overwhelming show of hands. Nearly the entire room raised in agreement, including two of the very board members who had once sat silently right beside Deborah at that very first coffee shop meeting so many long months earlier. Deborah left the community center alone that night, without any of her usual entourage trailing behind her, walking quickly to her car in a silence far heavier than any of the fines or threatening letters she had once so casually sent to our mailbox. I honestly didn't feel any real triumph watching her walk away that night. Mostly, I just felt genuinely tired, and a little sad for whatever exactly had driven someone to spend 9 years turning small-town neighborly power into something this corrosive, this quietly small and mean. Priya squeezed my shoulder gently as we walked out together into the parking lot. "You do realize you just became the single most talked about person in Willowcrest history," she said, laughing softly. I told her I'd happily trade all the attention for one perfectly normal, boring fence any day. The county police confirmed within just a few days that formal charges were being actively prepared against Deborah for criminal mischief related directly to the sabotage attempt, alongside a completely separate financial fraud investigation now formally opened by the state as well. The wall itself, meanwhile, stood fully finished and gleaming in the sun. 70 full feet of glass and steel that had started life as one family's simple message about a fence and had become, almost entirely by accident, the very thing that finally exposed everything else underneath it. I still hadn't fully decided what to do about the little observation platform business, now that the whole neighborhood clearly knew its real backstory in vivid detail. As it turned out, that particular decision would end up making me laugh harder than almost anything else in this whole strange ordeal. The independent audit officially began within just 2 weeks. Led by a careful forensic accountant the state's oversight division formally assigned after. Reviewing my original complaint in full, a quiet, thorough woman named Ms. Okafor who requested every single HOA financial record dating back a full decade. Deborah, still technically a homeowner though now fully suspended from the board, kept mostly to herself inside her house during those long weeks, her car rarely leaving the driveway at all. According to neighbors who still occasionally reported sightings almost like casual weather updates to each other. Renata told me the formal criminal mischief charge related to the sabotage attempt had officially been filed, and that Deborah's arraignment date had been set for early the following month. A fact soon confirmed publicly by the local news blog covering the whole ongoing story. The story had genuinely grown well beyond Willowcrest by that point. Picked up eagerly by a regional news outlet under a splashy headline about an HOA president accused of embezzlement and sabotage in bizarre glass wall feud, which several distant relatives promptly sent me, laughing out loud at the absurdity. I gave one brief, carefully worded statement to a visiting reporter, sticking strictly and deliberately to the documented, verifiable facts. politely declining to speculate on anything beyond what the ongoing audit and formal police reports would eventually, officially confirm entirely on their own. Frank, finally freed after years of quiet institutional compliance, became genuinely, surprisingly outspoken with the press, telling one reporter on the record that he had personally witnessed Deborah falsely claim board votes that had never actually occurred, more times than I can honestly even count anymore.
And his preliminary findings, quietly shared with the new board under seal, reportedly traced well over $180,000 in genuinely questionable transfers across 4 full years, far beyond just the single landscaping line item I had originally, personally uncovered on my own.
Some of that diverted money, according to Frank's second-hand account passed along carefully, had apparently gone directly toward Deborah's own private home. Renovations, including, almost too fittingly for the story, an expanded window installation completed the very same year our original fence first went up. I sat with that particular detail for a long, quiet moment when I first heard it explained to me. The entire sprawling conflict, in a strange and almost poetic, circular way, seemed to trace directly back to windows Deborah herself had paid for with money that was never truly hers to spend. The HOA soon scheduled a formal removal vote for Deborah's board membership entirely, a mostly symbolic gesture at that particular point, since state investigators had already effectively frozen her practical ability to act on the association's behalf in any meaningful way at all. I personally didn't attend that particular meeting myself. I'd already said everything I genuinely needed to say at the last one, and Renata sensibly advised staying visibly out of it now that the formal legal process had fully taken over from me completely. Priya texted me steady updates throughout the entire evening. Deborah hadn't shown up at all, sending instead a brief written resignation letter, only 2 full sentences long, citing vague personal reasons, and thanking the community for 9 years of dedicated, faithful service. The room, according to Priya's account afterward, actually laughed out loud together at the specific word, dedicated. A small, sharp collective release of 9 long years of built-up tension, finally allowed to genuinely surface out loud in front of actual witnesses in that room. Frank was voted in as interim president that very same night, in a nearly unanimous decision, and his very first official act was formally announcing a full, completely public accounting of the reserve fund findings at the next scheduled community meeting. I quietly closed down the Ridgeline View Partners observation platform business the following week, not out of any real legal pressure at all, but simply because the underlying joke, once its true backstory was fully public knowledge, suddenly felt sharper than I honestly wanted to keep carrying forward. Instead, I generously donated the platform's remaining seasonal bookings to the local school district's environmental science program, letting curious students use it directly for an ongoing bird migration study, which honestly felt like a far better, more meaningful ending for the strange little business. Tom joked warmly that we had somehow accidentally built the entire county's single most expensive birdwatching tower by pure accident. I told him that if that's genuinely how this whole story ended up getting remembered someday, I would honestly be completely fine with that particular outcome. The county's building inspector, carefully reviewing the sabotage evidence one final time for the ongoing police case, publicly confirmed that the wall's underlying engineering had actually exceeded standard residential safety requirements, the loosened bolts notwithstanding, entirely thanks to a smart, redundant anchor design built in from the very start. That particular detail genuinely mattered more to me than almost anything else across this entire long ordeal. I hadn't just built a symbolic message aimed at one person. I had built it carefully, precisely enough that Deborah's clumsy sabotage attempt genuinely, provably couldn't have brought the whole structure down at all. Renata began carefully preparing our formal restitution claim, now part of the larger criminal case moving steadily forward through the courts, covering our accumulated legal fees, the fence disputes, original fraudulent fines, and real damages directly related to the sabotage incident itself. Deborah's arraignment date finally arrived on a gray, overcast Tuesday morning. I personally didn't attend, choosing instead to simply drop Eli off at school and go quietly to work as usual, refusing to let that particular day define anything more than it practically needed to for our family. Frank texted me the update later that same afternoon. She had pleaded not guilty on both counts, been released on standard bail, with a trial date set for late fall, still several months away, though the separate embezzlement investigation was expected to add further formal charges well before then. Willowcrest, in the meantime, felt strangely, genuinely lighter across every street. Neighbors who had quietly avoided each other for months over old grudges and petty fence lines started talking openly again, almost a little sheepishly, like some long fever had finally, fully broken across the entire neighborhood at once. Priya organized an impromptu block party that following weekend, the first genuinely relaxed community gathering in over a full year, and even Frank himself showed up, looking noticeably lighter and visibly less burdened than I had ever once seen him look before across all those long meetings. Someone brought along a small homemade cake, decorated half-jokingly with a tiny fondant replica of the glass wall right on top of it. I honestly laughed harder at that small gesture than I had in months. The particular, absurd humor only an ordeal quite like this one could have ever produced.
Complete audit report, released publicly per standard state oversight requirements, confirmed a grand total of $214,000, diverted from the reserve fund across 4 full years, along with formal recommendations for entirely new mandatory financial controls going forward from that point on.
The new board, now led confidently by Frank, adopted every single one of those recommendations unanimously, along with a firm new rule requiring any future bylaw change to pass a full, documented board vote with clearly recorded minutes, a basic rule that, quite absurdly, hadn't ever formally existed before all of this. I sat quietly out on my own back porch one evening that week, watching the warm sunlight slowly move across the glass wall's smooth surface, and realized, honestly for the very first time in nearly a full year, that I felt something genuinely close to real peace about all of it at last. Renata called me the very next morning with news that would finally close out the last remaining open piece of the whole long ordeal. Deborah's own attorney had reportedly reached out quietly, hoping to discuss the real possibility of a plea deal well before the actual trial began. The plea negotiations themselves, Renata carefully explained to me, weren't really about establishing guilt or innocence anymore at all, given the evidence was already completely overwhelming, but rather about exactly how much of that full $214,000 Deborah could realistically ever be forced to fully repay. I told Renata plainly that I honestly didn't want any revenge measured only in raw dollar amounts alone. I genuinely wanted the entire community to hear, formally and completely, absolutely everything that had actually happened across those 9 quiet, carefully hidden years of Deborah's presidency. She agreed readily to push hard for a fully public restitution hearing rather than any quiet sealed settlement behind closed doors. A specific request Deborah's own attorney initially resisted quite hard, clearly hoping to keep the full damning scope well out of any local headlines. The presiding judge, reviewing both the criminal mischief charge and the separate fraud case together for basic efficiency, ultimately scheduled a single consolidated hearing, fully open to the general public, for the second week of October that year. Word of the upcoming hearing spread remarkably fast through all of Willowcrest. Frank told me the community center itself had to arrange special overflow seating, an entirely unprecedented request for what was, technically speaking, just a routine sentencing and restitution hearing, and not even a full formal trial. I genuinely debated for several full days beforehand whether to actually attend the hearing at all. Part of me simply wanted to let the formal legal system quietly finish what I had originally started. Another part of me still needed to personally see it all the way through, in person, to the very end. Tom ultimately decided for both of us, quietly, the night before the hearing. We built that entire wall together, side by side, he said gently. We really should be there together for this too. No matter what. I didn't argue with him at all. He was right, the way he usually, quietly was. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse steps outside were noticeably crowded with familiar faces from all across Willowcrest. An odd, quiet sense of solidarity among people who, just a single year earlier, had genuinely barely known each other's last names at all. Inside the courtroom, Deborah sat quietly beside her attorney, dressed plainly and simply, none of the polished, practiced authority she had once so confidently carried into every single HOA meeting like a well-worn weapon. She clearly knew exactly how to wield against ordinary, trusting people. The prosecutor walked methodically through the full evidence piece by piece, the invoices, the bank transfers, the sabotage footage, the bribery recording, each single piece landing heavily in the quiet courtroom with the same steady weight it had carried throughout the entire long investigation. When my own recording finally played aloud for the room, Deborah's voice clearly offering to waive HOA fees, so nobody has to know about it. Several people seated in the gallery audibly gasped out loud. The moment finally, publicly real in a way plain documents alone honestly never quite had been before. Deborah's attorney argued firmly for leniency, citing 9 years of otherwise unblemished, dedicated community service and no prior criminal record whatsoever, carefully framing the embezzlement as merely a series of poor judgment calls, rather than any deliberate, calculated theft on her client's part. The presiding judge, reviewing the clear 4-year pattern carefully laid out in Ms. Okafor's detailed audit, didn't appear at all persuaded by that framing, dryly noting aloud that poor judgment calls rarely came so neatly pre-organized through a shell company conveniently registered to a close family member. When finally given the chance to personally speak, Deborah stood slowly, hands trembling slightly at her sides, and said quietly that she'd only ever wanted what was genuinely best for Willowcrest, a familiar line that landed, in that particular courtroom, with almost nobody present truly believing a word of it anymore. I honestly hadn't planned to speak myself that day, but the judge, noticing several Willowcrest residents seated in the gallery, formally invited victim impact statements from the floor, and Frank quietly nudged me forward gently before I had even fully decided to stand up on my own. I kept my own statement deliberately simple and direct. I talked about the fence, the fraudulent fines, the recorded bribery attempt, the sabotage that could have genuinely hurt someone in my own family, and the quiet years other neighbors had silently paid rather than ever try to fight back themselves. I told the judge plainly that this particular case mattered well beyond just one HOA president and one especially bad year. It mattered deeply because ordinary people,
told repeatedly that a title carried real authority, too often simply believed it completely, even when it very clearly, obviously didn't.
The judge's final sentencing addressed both cases together as one unified whole, the criminal mischief charge for the sabotage attempt, and the fraud charge for the embezzled funds, weighing them together as clearly connected evidence of one broader, sustained pattern of serious misconduct. Deborah received 18 months total, with all but 4 months formally suspended pending full restitution, alongside 5 full years of supervised probation, a permanent statewide ban from ever serving in any HOA leadership role again, and mandatory full repayment of the entire $214,000. The courtroom gallery stayed quiet throughout the actual sentencing, with no real cheering at all, though I did notice several neighbors quietly reach for each other's hands nearby, a small, deeply human release after 9 long years of quiet, unspoken frustration finally, publicly validated out loud together. Deborah didn't look at anyone at all as she was formally let out for processing, her attorney quickly gathering scattered papers behind her. The entire scene ending with far less visible drama than the many long months leading up to it had honestly suggested it might. Outside on the crowded courthouse steps afterward, reporters gathered quickly around, and I gave one final, brief public statement that I sincerely hoped this whole case would encourage other HOA members, anywhere at all, to actually read their own bylaws carefully and start asking harder questions. Priya hugged me tightly out on the steps, whispering that she honestly couldn't quite believe it was finally, truly over. I told her gently that it wasn't fully over just yet. The restitution payments, the ongoing civil recovery process, all of it would still genuinely take several more years to fully resolve. But the part that mattered most to me personally, the part that had genuinely kept me awake so many long nights that entire spring, was finally over at last. The full truth was now public record, thoroughly documented, completely undeniable, no longer something merely whispered quietly at mailboxes between neighbors. That same evening, Frank called an emergency board meeting of his own, not out of any crisis this time, but pure genuine celebration, announcing that recovered funds, even just the partial amounts already in hand, would go first toward finally repairing infrastructure Deborah had quietly neglected for years. The reserve fund, slowly rebuilt under strict new financial controls, would finally repave the pothole-riddled entrance road that residents had openly complained about for well over a full decade. A small but genuinely concrete symbol of exactly what real accountability could actually produce for a community. I was asked, almost jokingly at first, whether I might want to run for a seat on the board myself. I declined immediately, laughing warmly. I've genuinely had enough HOA drama to last one entire lifetime, I told them honestly. I just want one normal, boring fence now. Honestly, Tom gently pointed out that our own fence, technically speaking, was now 70 feet tall and made entirely of glass, which was decidedly, hilariously not remotely normal by any Willowcrest standard, before or after Deborah's long presidency had ever even fully begun in the first place. I told him warmly that we could talk seriously about eventually lowering it someday. Once the county's remaining boundary paperwork had formally closed out for good. Once everything genuinely tied to this whole long ordeal had finally, completely settled quietly into the past for us. For now, though, the wall itself simply stayed exactly where it already was. Glass steadily catching the morning light across the entire street. 60 different families who'd once quietly whispered nervously about Deborah now simply, warmly calling it Mara's Wall with genuine open affection. It had all started as one ordinary family's quiet answer to a bully who happened to hold a title. It had ultimately ended as the very thing that finally gave an entire neighborhood back its own voice, the shared trust, and its simple, quiet mornings once again. In the weeks immediately following sentencing, Ms. Okafor's office formally finalized the civil restitution schedule, carefully structured as steady monthly payments from Deborah directly to the HOA's reserve fund, firmly enforced through the court system itself under the specific terms of her ongoing probation. Deborah's house, it soon turned out, had actually been quietly listed for sale within just days of the public hearing. The beloved hilltop view she had once fought so relentlessly hard to protect apparently no longer even worth quietly staying to personally look at anymore. A young couple bought the house that following winter, and during their very first week living in the neighborhood, Priya thoughtfully made a point of inviting them over to dinner, gently telling them, "Just so you both know, all the fence drama around here is genuinely over now." Frank's newly reconstituted board formally rewrote the entire HOA bylaws that fall, deliberately closing every loophole Deborah had quietly exploited for years. Mandatory recorded votes on all decisions, fully public financial reporting, and a firm hard limit on any single officer's unilateral personal authority going forward. The comprehensive new bylaws passed unanimously that night. Homeowners packing the community center once again, though this time not at all out of anger or genuine fear, but rather out of real, genuine investment in making absolutely sure nobody could ever quietly repeat what Deborah had done again. I was personally asked to help draft the new transparency section myself, given my well-known documentation habits by then, and spent one long evening, together with Frank, carefully turning 9 hard years of painful lessons into plain language simple enough that nobody could ever easily misuse it again. The other families who had quietly suffered under Deborah's old violations, the garden shed, the arborvitae trees, the basketball hoop, each formally received sincere apologies from the entirely new board, along with full reimbursement for their old, genuinely unjust fines paid years earlier. Priya actually cried a little reading her own family's letter aloud at the following board meeting, admitting openly that she had genuinely believed, for a full 2 years straight, that she and her family had simply, personally done something wrong by planting a few innocent trees. I told her gently, afterward, that this was exactly what people like Deborah always quietly counted on, good, entirely reasonable people simply assuming. The real problem must be their own behavior, rather than recognizing someone else's quiet, sustained abuse of borrowed institutional authority all along. The little glass wall business, Ridgeline View Partners, formally dissolved that following winter. Its very final seasonal booking generously donated, quite fittingly, to that same environmental science program that had already used the platform for its ongoing bird migration study earlier that same year. A local news outlet ran a brief, thoughtful follow-up piece several months later, calling the wall itself an accidental monument to real accountability, a description I honestly found a little grand for my own taste, though Tom insisted on proudly framing the printed article anyway for our hallway. Eli, now finally old enough to genuinely understand most of what had actually happened over that strange year, asked me quietly one evening why I hadn't simply just lowered the original fence right at the very beginning and avoided this whole exhausting, drawn-out ordeal entirely. I told him gently that some fights aren't really about the specific thing everyone's openly arguing over on the surface at all. Sometimes they're really about whether people who hold real power get to simply make up their own rules just because nobody ever bothers to stop and check them. He thought about that quietly for a long moment, then asked hopefully if we could possibly keep the wall standing forever, because all his friends from school apparently thought it was the single coolest thing on the whole entire street. I told him warmly that we'd genuinely see about that. Deborah's court-ordered restitution payments arrived steadily throughout the following year. According to Frank's regular quarterly board reports, slow but genuinely consistent, the community's reserve fund climbing patiently back toward what it always should have honestly held all along. From the very start, the long pothole-ridden entrance road finally got fully repaved that following spring. A small, wonderfully unglamorous victory that somehow still felt far more genuinely satisfying to the whole community than even the formal courtroom verdict itself had ever quite managed to feel entirely on its own. I ran into Deborah exactly one more time after all of it. At the grocery store the following summer, both of us reaching quietly for the very same shelf item. She looked noticeably smaller than I remembered her. Quieter too. The practiced public warmth now entirely, completely gone from her. She said only, "I sincerely hope your family's doing well these days." And I told her, honestly and simply, that we genuinely were. Neither one of us ever mentioned the wall, the original fence, or the long 9 years that had eventually led us both to that particular quiet grocery aisle. I honestly didn't feel any real sense of triumph watching her quietly walk away that day, the way I might have genuinely expected to feel just one single year earlier. Mostly, I simply felt like an entirely ordinary neighbor again, at long last, standing in an entirely ordinary grocery store. That small moment, more than any courtroom verdict or fully rebuilt reserve fund ever could, honestly felt like the real, true ending, not sweet revenge exactly, but rather the simple, hard-won return of an entire community's basic, shared sense of fairness once again. Willowcrest quietly kept its comprehensive new bylaws, its slowly rebuilt collective trust, and its one impossibly tall glass wall, standing peacefully along the woodland edge, permanent, sunlit reminder of exactly what happens when good, ordinary people finally decide to stop staying quiet altogether. A full year after the sentencing, the HOA proudly held its very first fully transparent annual meeting, complete with a genuine public financial report, live-recorded official minutes, and, at Frank's own personal insistence, actual real snacks instead of Deborah's old, familiar bare folding tables. I was elected, somewhat against my own genuine protests at the time, to a newly created transparency committee, a role I ultimately accepted mostly because Priya cheerfully threatened to nominate me for it every single year until I finally simply agreed to say yes. The wall itself, now often covered in a light layer of mourning due most quiet mornings, had genuinely become something of an unofficial neighborhood landmark, even appearing in local real estate listings as conveniently adjacent to Willowcrest's famous glass wall, without any real hint of intended irony at all. Tom and I finally sat down and discussed lowering it properly that following spring, mostly just as a simple formality by that point, before ultimately deciding together, and a little sentimentally, to leave it standing exactly as it already was, at its full, wonderfully absurd 70 feet. It genuinely wasn't about spite anymore by that point, if it had ever fully been. It had simply, quietly become part of our own home's larger story. The strange, glittering monument to the year one HOA president had badly mistaken a simple title for permission to take absolutely whatever she personally wanted. Some quiet nights, I still find myself standing at our kitchen window, watching the last soft light of evening move slowly across 70 full feet of glass, remembering just how small this whole thing had once genuinely seemed to be. Just a simple fence. Just one small, unfair rule. It never really was about a fence at all. Not truly. Not underneath it all. It was always really about whether ordinary people, without any titles or gavels or laminated official decrees behind them, could still stand firmly on their own ground when someone powerful decided the rules simply didn't apply to them. In the end, Willowcrest finally got its own answer, written plainly in glass and steel, and 9 long years of quiet complicity finally, publicly broken wide open. Deborah, in her own way, eventually got her beloved view back too, just never again quite the one she had originally so badly wanted.